Hello. Hi.
Hello.
bit of a pause there. Hi, year nines and tens who may be watching and listening to this. We are now on lesson six, and it's on one of our favourite topics to discuss when we're looking at inspector calls, and that is the character of Gerald, and posing a question, which is he a likable character? And how does Priestley choose to present him in Act 2? So just a quick sort of update on where we're up to. So we've reached the end of Act 1 and we've concluded with a little bit of a cliffhanger. What has Gerald been up to? And I'm just going to hide our faces now so you can look at the screen. What has he been up to? And we've also realised at this point that Sheila has metaphorically had her eyes opened by the inspector, and she feels responsible for her part in Eva Smith's death. Okay, so she feels a sense of guilt right now. It's Gerald's turn, and we're going to see if he's going to learn anything from the inspector. And the spotlight is now on him, and we're going to just, because of the complexity of Gerald's character, we're just going to do a bit more background on him. So I'm going to hand over to Mrs. Marshall, and she's going to talk you through this character.
Okay, so in terms of Gerald so far, we've talked about him a little bit in previous videos about his initial description as being this easy, well-bred man about town, and we've talked about the importance of that description, in particular the word easy, that his privilege and his status in life does come easy to him, and he's used to things working in his favour because of his privilege. His parents are Lord and Lady Croft, so they are from the aristocracy, so which would be considered the ruling class in Edwardian times. And so Gerald's character represents the upper classes in the play, and so he can be seen as a little bit of a metaphor for what Priestley thinks about the upper classes. He's quite a tricky character, Gerald, because in terms of preparing for an exam question spectacles, you'll often think about perhaps getting questions on the older and younger generation and who learns and who doesn't. But Gerald doesn't really fit neatly into the older or the younger generation. He is the younger generation in terms of age, but because of his aristocratic background, he's a bit more complex than that. And he represents some more deeply ingrained prejudices in class that are not so easily removed, in the sense that Eric and Sheila's sort of changes that they start to make towards the end of the play perhaps represent a genuine remorse and a genuine desire to change, whereas for Gerald, he perhaps is a lot more tricky. It's tricky. It's a lot more tricky to kind of think about how he might progress as a character. So he is, first of all, when he is put under the spotlight, he is very evasive right from the start. It's quite clear that he does try to cover up the story of his affair with Daisy Renton. He tries to encourage Sheila to lie about it before the inspector comes in. And he in the end he kind of blurts it out, if you must have it. He's forced to give his confession in terms of covering it up, and there's something about the way in which he tells his story, as we'll touch upon later, which suggests that he's perhaps not entirely trustworthy. And this is something that perhaps Priestley wants to highlight about the upper classes. In terms of context, Priestley had a dislike for the upper classes, and a lot of this came from experiences of the war. As we know, the audiences in 1945 would have been post-war. They've experienced the bringing together of classes over the course of the war, fighting alongside each other. Whereas Priestley's experience of the war was that the upper classes, that were known as the officer class, they would often have the positions of power, would then send the working classes out into the war over the top to die, while they sort of stayed out of trouble in the safe spots. And he did sort of thought the same about the upper classes in general, the idea that they left the cities and fled to more comfortable homes in the country to try and avoid actually being out there and fighting alongside others or being in danger. And so he sort of felt that the upper classes represented everything that was wrong with Britain, that they only thought about themselves. And so that's something that Gerald represents. What else do you reckon, Miss Harrison and Miss Wham?
Miss Harrison, do you have anything to add?
Not really. I think it's the fact that we as an audience are kind of, especially as Mrs. Marshall already said, the post-war 1945 audience, they're set up to, as people did, dislike characters like Gerald, who kind of got life handed to them on a plate because of their privilege and the status and their position in on the social ladder and in society itself. And I think a lot of people people who analyse the play say that he's a character to potentially bridge the gap between younger and older characters, because he, as Mrs. Marshall said, yes, he is a younger character, but he's kind of at the older end of the younger characters. He's not as young as Sheila and Eric. So there's this kind of there's hope within him, even though he is an upper class character who parallels Berlin a lot of the time throughout the play. He has got age on his side, essentially, because like Sheila and Eric, he could be a character that could take responsibility, show remorse, and reform himself. But that by the end of the play, that doesn't happen at all. And it's really suggestive of the fact that, again, as Mrs. Marshall has already said, that it's the values of the upper classes that are so ingrained within them that it's really hard to break. So,
yeah, I think that's a really good additional comment, Miss Harrison, because I do agree that Gerald, whilst he has got age on his side, he is somebody that, because of his privilege, is holding back the progress that could be made if people were willing to change. There's a couple of things that I read up on about Gerald, and it's quite interesting how he's presented at the start as this man that's quite self-assured and confident, because the privilege that he's been born with means that he it builds that kind of confidence within him, doesn't it, that he sort of doesn't need to have additional stresses on his life, which I think is one of the reasons. But also the way that he sort of brings up obscure references at the start kind of creates a distance, which Priestley mentions in some of his past works. And he said, he once said he felt that sometimes there was a you and I attitude between the aristocratic and the I guess the working class, and he quite sort of obviously sets himself as somebody who's on the side of the high fence, who's in some ways in this exclusive club in which the audience don't belong. In some ways, by setting up that distance, when he mentions the governor at the start of the play, that he knows him, it sets you up with that distance to where you think Gerald is this likeable character. And his name as well, Croft. I think this is something I learned from Mrs. Marshall a while ago. It means enclosed land. So his name is symbolic of the membership of the property class, and there's not a massive percentage of the population at the time that were part of that. Was it like 5%? Yeah, so I think it was like between 2 and 5%. So again, he represents this minority that seems to hold so much power over the majority. So I'm going to move back to Mrs. Marshall because her quote's first.
Yes, so absolutely, yeah. I forgot about his name point, because again, with it being a cut-off piece of land as well, it suggests that he believes that he's untouchable. And as well, your point about him sort of having nothing to prove at the beginning. Berlin's desperate to suck up to him, isn't he? But Lord and Lady Croft haven't attended the dinner. And so all he can do is suck up to Gerald. But Gerald doesn't need to know about port, because he's naturally born into the aristocracy, so he doesn't need to brag about things and potentially impress people, because he's so used to this easy life of privilege that he, like you say, he doesn't have to really, he's never had to worry about anything. So that kind of brings us on to the sort of life that he's used to, and that was perhaps expected of the upper classes and not judged. And this is the use of prostitutes, basically, because Gerald's sordid affair is revealed in his grilling, and the first thing that's revealed is where he's actually met Daisy Renton. And as I said before, he is quite evasive. He obviously doesn't want it to come out, really, and he does everything in his power to prevent Sheila from being there. So just before he's about to tell the story about him going to the Palace Bar, which all the family seem to know is a place where you would go to pick up a prostitute. It seems to be sort of common knowledge. Before he starts to tell this tale, he does try to get rid of Sheila, and he suggests that she's, it's to protect her. You don't want to hear about this sort of thing. He talks to her as if she's a child. You've had a long and exciting and tiring day, dear. You don't want to hear about this. And again, as we've talked about before, really, it's just his own self-preservation. He's embarrassed to tell this story in front of Sheila. So it's quite significant that he tries to present himself in this way as a protector of her gender, when as actually what he's doing is suppressing her gender and suppressing her voice, because she wants to stay, wants to be enlightened, and he tries to prevent her from doing that. And sort of tries to make out she's just a hysterical female. Eventually then he's forced to talk about it, and this is the quote that I've chosen, is the way that he words his going to the Palace Bar, and that's that he goes there with favourite haunt of women of the town, is the way that he puts it. And I think his vocabulary is very telling of the idea that he is very much used to presenting himself in a certain way, and it makes his account really untrustworthy, because he's very you can tell he's very careful about the way that he tells it and how he's used to presenting himself. So his language is euphemistic, which means that he doesn't just come out and say something bluntly. He tries to make it appear better than what it is. So by using a favourite haunt of women of the town would be a nicer way of saying a prostitute. He doesn't, because he's embarrassed to actually admit what he's done. So I think that's quite significant, that his language reflects his desire to evade the truth. But also we could read into some of the language used there as well, that the word haunt in particular. So if we looked at that word, we could think about having a double meaning, that a haunt of women of the town suggests that the women who go there are sort of ghostly figures in some way. So we could either look at that as if this is how they are seen by the upper class men that use them, that they're not even real people. Again, they're sort of dehumanized, they're not really there, sort of ghostly apparitions in some way. It could also, the word haunt could also reflect their sort of traumatic lives that they've led, and their lack of identity, because they've had to turn to this position. So it's a really interesting quote to be able to perhaps look at the position of working class women, but also the way that they are kind of used by the men that go there. And it fits in with Gerald's sort of easy belief in his superiority, that, he just happened to look into the Palace Bar. I just dropped by. There's no reason why he would go there unless he was deliberately searching out a prostitute. And so the way that he talks about his story is really quite important, because it shows the way that he tries to to protect himself and ameliorate himself all the time, which means to make himself appear better than what he is. He even talks about how he doesn't like the prostitutes there, that they're hard-eyed and dough-faced, that he doesn't want to sleep with women that are hardened by life. And in contrast, Daisy Renton is described as having sort of soft brown hair and big eyes, and he's attracted to her innocence, and yet the way he makes himself out to be is very different, which I think Miss Wan's going to touch on next in the quote that she's chosen, because you're going to talk a little bit about how Gerald presents himself as a bit of a hero, I believe, Miss Wan.
Yeah, I think when I was listening to you about this idea of him happening to be there, and it's interesting because in the sense that his feelings of feeling superior are well established, because I think he actually sees himself as better than the men that are there, because they talk about a minor character, Joe Megati, and the way that he's described is quite vulgar, how he almost tries to like corner Eva Smith at the bar, and he was the one that rescued him. So he sees himself as this person that's a saviour almost, when actually he's probably no better than Joe Megati, because what was he doing there in the first place? And the second thing I was thinking is this idea, I don't know if it's a reflection of the maybe a criticism of excess in some sense, because I think some of the Edwardian values that were handed to privileged men were sort of off the back of was it King Edward, who was known for being quite excess with his food and entertainment and his money. He was quite sort of in that way. I think it's sort of similar to how privileged men sort of copied that behaviour. And so when I think about him going down to the bar, I think it's this idea of excess, that he, you know, goes there to sort of meet other women. It's that indulgent, isn't it? Indulgence.
Absolutely. I agree with what you said about Alderman Megati. Although he's extremely minor, you could actually write an entire response, I think, for GCSE on what he represents, really, that kind of double standard, and is really particularly important as a parallel character to Gerald in this particular scene, because Gerald describes him as sort of wedging her in with his fat carcass, and like you said, really vulgar language, and very critical of his appearance as well, like a carcass, sort of bearing down on her. Whereas because he is young and good looking, I think it raises a really important question as well for how we read the play as modern readers and modern watchers, because on more than one occasion, because I hate Gerald so much, I've had arguments with students about Gerald, who, you know, I've said, you know, posed the question, do you think, I've even said, you know, are they the same, Alderman Megati and Gerald? And a lot of them said, no, but Miss, he's good looking, it's not the same, is it? You know, if somebody rapes somebody, for example, I'm not saying this is exactly what happened, although his behaviour is very questionable, does it make it better if the person was ugly or good looking, or from a higher class or a lower class? It's the exact same act, and I think Priestley deliberately uses Megati, who obviously has a very high status, and you know, Mrs. Burling is so shocked by his behaviour, but it's not, is it any different to what Gerald does just because of the way that he presents himself and the fact that he's better looking, as some of my students pointed out? I won't name any names.
I completely, I get that, because I mean, I hate Gerald, but equally I love talking about Gerald because he's such a hypocrite, and it's the exact same actions, but he, like you said, he paints Joe Megati as this sort of, I don't know, this is a bit extreme, but he's a bit like, he paints him like a bit of a pervert that's there. And then he almost, because of his social conditioning and because of his sort of privilege, he believes that he's this fairy prince that's come to rescue, and that's absolutely not the case, because they're there for the same reason and they're just as bad as each other. But he refuses to see himself and his actions in the same light, and that's why I hate him so much. I might just go on to my quote. Shall I
go for it? Yeah, I think it leads really well on to your quote.
I mean, usually I like to like zoom in on language and whatnot, but not so much with this. I feel like I've got a bit more of a critical stance, like a couple of things I've noticed about this quote. So this quote, the girl saw me looking at her and then gave me a look that was nothing less than a cry for help. So my feeling with this is that it starts off with something that I learned about quite recently that I applied to another text that I teach. So when you get into year 10, you'll be learning about My Last Duchess, and it's something I learned about the male gaze. So I wonder if I could apply it to this quote. So the male gaze is all this idea of the way that women are depicted in literature from the perspective of a man. And it's usually in a sexualized way or an objectified way. So when the girl saw me looking at her and they gave me a look that was nothing less than a cry for help. Now this I think shows that in some ways this is the start of Gerald's objectification of Eva Smith, and I want to sort of pose a couple of things to Miss Harrison and Mrs. Marshall. If we were looking at it from a contemporary audience, so post 1945, I feel like this is the start of some sort of grooming process, whether you would call it grooming in 1912 or whether Priestley would understand that term, because at this point, she's painted in a very, very vulnerable light. Again, we've got the noun girl that we've mentioned before in past lessons that show you the vulnerability of her. The fact that Miss Marshall mentioned earlier, and this is my build-up of the argument, that he contrasts the hard these women with and describes Eva Smith with soft brown hair again, paints her as someone that's quite fragile, okay, who needs to be looked after. And so the reason why I think he sort of exploits his power and in some ways does it in a way that abuses Eva is that he sees that she's quite vulnerable, and then he tries to gain a trust because he sort of takes her away from Joe Meggerty. Then he installs her and sends her away. He gives her food. And there's a bit where he says that she was really hungry, and so he makes sure she gets some food, and then she goes to a house that he sets up for her. So this is all sort of the build up of the story, which he tries to paint as a way of sort of saving her and being this savior, like I mentioned earlier. So when I look at this, the reason why I chose this quote is that I think the way that Priestley paints Gerald at this point is that it's the start of the objectification of it, and I wonder what Mrs. Marshall and Miss Harrison have to add to that.
I agree completely. There's definitely parallels with kind of, what we would consider modern day, as you've already said, grooming. Again, I think it's this idea of Gerald painting himself as the savior of Eva, and like you've said, he's kind of diminishing his own responsibility in order to get this sense of fulfillment, almost, that he, as you've already said, and Sheila does call him, oh, you must have been the fairy prince. But even when you're looking at that quote, how he sees himself isn't the reality at all. He's doing the exact same thing as Joe Meggerty. He is objectifying her, he's using her, he's abusing his power as a member of the elite class. And it's all about profit all the time. I'm going to come on into my quote in a second about the fact that he refers to it as business. It's all about how can he profit from this working class woman. And in this case, it's to him profiting on his sexual desires.
Yeah. And I think her name, we mentioned Gerald's name earlier, but her name, the fact that she changes her name to Daisy Renton at this point in the play is quite significant as well, because if you look at those two words, you could look at Daisy as a symbol of innocence, which fits into some of the other quotes that we've looked at. Again, the fairy prince, the soft brown hair, the big eyes, but then the Renton, which again sort of financial language again, which Miss Harrison's going to elaborate on further. The idea that she is rented pleasure for the upper classes, which I know we mentioned when we were preparing, the idea that he says he doesn't install her there to make love, but the connotations of a machine there as if she's there to be used as a tool for his pleasure, which again leads quite nicely onto what you're going to discuss, Miss Harrison.
Yeah, and I think, and we have to remember from a contextual standpoint, when we think about the vulnerability of Eva, is that she would be someone that they would describe in 1912, and I guess the 1945 audience would understand, even when things were sort of becoming a little bit more progressive for women. She would be described as at this point, if she's willing to be a prostitute, not willing, but having to be a prostitute, and she's been forced into that position, she'll be described as a fallen woman. And once you get that label, that's pretty much sort of your opportunities in terms of appearing respectable in society are basically destroyed. Because it's also, you know, obvious that she's not married, she's single, so she hasn't got a husband to depend on. So and this is why I think he pretty much, you know, uses that vulnerability and exploits it. And I think all these things that were starting to come through Gerald's actions at this bar and with Eva actually shows you the sort of Priestley wanting to show you how the exploitation of the rich also is like, it's a criticism, isn't it? And just that, and their moral corruption as well. So we're going to move on to Miss Harrison's quote. So I'm just going to move on to that. Here we are.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, guys, so this is pretty much the last thing that Gerald says before he wanders off to go and find a loophole to get himself out of any trouble. So he says this quote: so in that case, I'm rather more upset by this business than I probably appear to be, and well, I'd like to be alone for a while. I'd be glad if you'd let me go. So potentially at first glance, you're probably not going to think that there's much to say about this, but if we get into it, there's loads you can say. So it's this idea I'd like to start off with about Gerald appearing to be upset. You know, he has had moments during his interrogation where it seems like he genuinely had some affection and cared about Eva Smith. And the inspector acknowledges that as well when he said that in her diary it seemed that he did make her happy for a time. And again, we've got, you know, the use of the punctuation, the repetition of hyphens and things. It creates this stuttering effect, which could be suggestive of the fact that he is genuinely upset by the fact that she's dead. And he recognises that earlier on in his interrogation, where he says, "My God, I've just realised that she's really dead." But more so, I think that this whole quotation is a good quote to use if you get a question on something like appearance versus reality, or public versus private, things like that. So he actually says in this quote that he appears to be upset. So again, is he really upset by Eva's death, or is it something else that he's upset by? All the way through his interrogation, he wants to remain respectable in the eyes of the Berlins. He's got a lot to lose if the engagement with Sheila is called off. So he wants to remain respectable in the eyes of Berlin, and Mrs. Berlin particularly. He wants to absolve himself of any guilt. Like we've already said, he wants to come across as a hero to Eva Smith, the one who swooped in and saved her from this terrible fate of having to prostitute herself. So he tries to justify his affair with Eva Smith. He says that she was desperate, and you know, if I hadn't come in at that moment, she would have been you know, potentially raped by Joe Megarty and has potentially starved to death. And the language that he uses is very dramatic to try and plead his case almost. So I think the fact that he says he appears to be upset, or is rather more upset than he appears to be, links nicely to the fact that earlier on in the play he said that the Berlins are a nice, well-behaved family, which by now we know that they're not. He says at the start of his interrogation that they're respectable citizens, not criminals. Again, there's hardly anything respectable about what he did to Eva Smith. So it's this irony of what he thinks he is very different to how the audience sees him. So next I'm going to zoom in on this noun business. He refers to his situation, his encounter with Eva Smith, as business a lot. He says that he doesn't come into this suicide business, and that, as Mrs. Marshall's already said, that he didn't install her there to make love to her. And it's all of this dehumanising language when he's talking about the situation with Eva. And it's suggestive that, you know, obviously we've got the connotations of business to do with profit, like I already said. He profits not in a financial sense, but in a selfish sense. He profits through his sexual desires by having an encounter with Eva Smith. And it's suggestive the fact that these kind of values of superiority are ingrained in the upper classes, and they're a lot harder to remove than you might think. And that's potentially why, while Gerald is a younger character, he doesn't change like Eric and Sheila do, because his position in society is more ingrained in him than Sheila and Eric's are, just because of his age. So what's arguable here, again with that noun business, is, does his language in this supposed apology or supposed, you know, form of remorse that he's upset by what's happened to Eva Smith, the fact that he's using the word business, and the fact that he's only appearing to be upset, and what I'm going to come on to in a second, the fact that he refers to himself and how it's making him feel constantly, is it making this apology seem disingenuous? Again, it's all about him and how he's feeling. Whereas, you know, when Sheila's talked about Eva Smith's death, it's more about, especially towards the end of the play, how she felt and how horrible it must have been for her, destroying herself, like she says. So I'm going to come on to finally this repetition of the personal pronoun I. So again, we've got the potential him feeling remorse that he's upset by what's happened. But again, this repetition of I kind of counteracts that and makes it seem not genuine. It makes us as an audience question whether this is the reality of how he's feeling. So it reiterates the self-interest and the selfishness of the upper classes. And Gerald does things out of self-interest a lot throughout the play. He goes to the Palace Bar out of his own selfishness, sexual desires. He goes on a mission after the inspector, after he leaves the Berlins' house, to find himself a loophole, and to find himself and people like him, i.e. the Berlins, a loophole to get out of any responsibility, and, like I've said, to absolve himself of any responsibility in Eva Smith's death. Because at the end of the day, if he and the Berlins are caught up, as Mr. Berlin says, in a scandal, it's not going to do them any favours in terms of their reputation and their position in society. So, yeah, it's all about his self-interest and what he wants, and that's really reinforced through this repetition of I. So, yeah, once he's done with Eva Smith, that's it. She's discarded. As the inspector says, he uses her. And it's because she's not a good investment. She can't bring to him what she bring to him, and arguably, again, is Gerald more concerned with himself and his reputation and the damage that'll do to his reputation if this scandal gets out, than he is genuinely upset about it? I think it's more so to do with him and his reputation, which is again why a lot of people see parallels between him and Berlin, and it's arguably again why he doesn't change, because he's more concerned with himself than anyone else. Have you guys anything to add to that?
I think we're getting near the point we need to sort of sum up, I suppose, aren't we? So I suppose it, in terms of, you've mentioned the idea that it is actually Gerald that comes up with the loophole at the end. In terms of writing about that in an essay, you could talk about how that's a deliberate act by Priestley to make Gerald, the representative of the upper classes, be the one to find the loophole, because he actually then prevents the Burlings from coming to any harm in terms of their reputation. He maintains their reputation and protects it, and so therefore you could see that as a metaphor for society, that Priestley believed that it was the upper classes that were holding back progress in terms of class.
And yeah, I thought that was a really good analysis of the bit that he says before he leaves the scene, and this idea of when I was looking at the last sentence, I'd be glad if you'd let me go. I think this is why he goes and finds the loophole as well. Another reason we could argue is that I'd be glad if you'd let me go. It kind of emphasizes a reduction in power. Maybe Gerald doesn't like feeling smaller, and this is why he probably, whether it's a subconscious thing, goes off and tries to find the loophole to preserve his reputation. And I think let's reverse it and say he did love her. The sad thing is about what Priestley might be saying about this is that the rigidity of the class structure would mean those two could never be together, because you couldn't. It wouldn't be socially acceptable, and if appearance means more to Gerald than anything else, then he's going to choose his reputation, his appearance, rather than his love for Eva, if he did love her. Because we could argue that maybe he did have some feelings for her, because he shows a little bit remorse. But this depends on how you as a student decide to go with your essay. Which critical viewpoint do you want to take? Is he a nice guy, or is he actually this hypocrite? I think. Yeah.
And I personally think that if you just kind of dangle it in front of us, the idea that Gerald might be genuinely sorry, but then he takes it away towards the end with how triumphant he is when he finds the loophole. That's my personal take. Yeah. By using that, then he deliberately takes it away at the end, which is why I hate him.
Yeah, I absolutely do as well. And we've only got a 40-minute timeline, so I feel like we're going to have to end it there. Does anybody have anything to say before we go?
I won't have a good word said about Gerald.
No, I hate him, and I hope you guys do too. But also, you've got your own opinions.
Yes, Gerald.
Right. We'll all see you again next week. We're moving on to, is it Mrs. Berlin?
Mrs. B.
Yeah.
And Mrs. B. Okay, we'll see you guys later.
See you later.
Bye. Bye.